one thing that most people have probably heard of, which is Israel's probably the most famous anti-air, anti-missile defense system called Iron Dome. Um, how do you think that it actually performed in the conflict? And do you think it stood up to its reputation for, the most famous and best developed defense of this kind?
Yeah, great question. I mean, um, Israeli missile defense really is special for two reasons, right? Israel is a fairly small country, so it is relatively easy to cover the entire country with air and missile defense, much more so than for I'd say most other countries in the world, essentially. So right, definitely Ukraine. We see how large that country is, how difficult it has been for Ukraine, not only to defend Kiev and maybe a couple other large population centers, but really every major city from Russian missile attacks. That's just very, very difficult with the limited number of missile systems, missile defense systems that they have available. And that's not the case for Israel, right? So small country, small territory. But at the same time, right, given the fact that they have been surrounded for decades now by actors that have emphasized missile and rocket capabilities, so airborne projectiles to threaten Israel's security, they obviously then also place doctrinally and operationally large emphasis on missile defense capabilities or projectile defense capabilities. And so you get this mix of small territory but very high density of missile defense capabilities, which in principle, right, allows for what you said, this very reputationally high missile defense system that has a very high reputational standing in the world. And the thing is, it has been tested, throughout the last couple of decades, but really only at the lower tiers. So you can envision the Israeli missile defense system as consisting of three tiers. It has the lower tier, which is Iron Dome, right? The one that is, I think, most famous in popular discourse, which is supposed to defend against, mortar grenades, artillery grenades, smaller rocket artillery that is flying into Israel and intercept those. And it has done so very successfully. Then there's the medium tier, which largely consists of a system called David's Sling. And that is supposed to defend against cruise missiles, smaller ballistic missiles, short-range ballistic missiles, but also long-range drones. And then at the upper tier, you have the Arrow system, which I think, has also been talked about quite a lot, especially in Europe, in light of Germany's procurement of the system, which is supposed to defend against medium-range ballistic missiles and is actually intercepting those outside the atmosphere at a very high altitude. And so over the last decades, the lower tier has repeatedly been tested, including by non-state actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, and those regional proxies of Syria and Iran. And now, over the last year or two, starting in 2024, in April 2024, when Iran launched the first large-scale missile barrage at Israel, that is when you also saw those higher tier systems in action, particularly Arrow. And obviously, throughout this 12-day war, these systems were tested repeatedly and intensively. So overall, I would say that the missile defense system performed as expected, if not slightly better. So if not slightly overperformed expectations. So by and large, I think prior to the war, analysts, or at least, I can only speak for myself, but I think, other analysts probably would have shared this opinion, that you would have expected an interception rate of around 80 to 90% for Iranian medium-range ballistic missiles. And according to the Israelis, it appears that they intercepted closer to 90%. So at the upper end of that estimate. And there are a couple of reasons why this may have been the case. It is that they got help from the Americans. They deployed 2 THAAD batteries and also naval assets with aided in missile defense. You actually saw those lower tier systems that I just explained, that are nominally speaking only supposed to defend against lower range threats, actually defend against medium range ballistic missile projectiles, including Iron Dome, which, something I would have never expected to see. They actually launched Iron Dome interceptors against incoming medium range ballistic missiles, and it worked. And there's at least one confirmed intercept that was caught on video. So that is really, really impressive, really speaks to the quality of those systems. But it also speaks a bit, to the urgency of the situation. I mean, if you're launching those types of interceptors, that means you're running low on the higher end, and that was definitely the case, right? So I think and then that was also a really important reason why I was successful is that Israel, they just managed to intercept a lot of missiles before they were launched. I think if they had not done that, we might have reached a point of interceptor depletion, so that Israel would have run out at those higher levels.
Well, that was my next question. If a factor is that the war ended up being pretty short and compared to Ukraine, that's been facing attacks for several years, it must ration the types of anti-air missiles defenses, whereas Israel can kind of just put everything that's out there for the 12 days that the war lasts. And if it was facing an attritional war like Ukraine, probably then the effectivity would go down. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. So I think, we don't know how a war of attrition would have looked like between Israel and Iran, given that it's over now. But I think, Israel would have had some advantages. The most important one, obviously, that they had full control over Iranian skies, right? They had air superiority throughout the country. They had air dominance over large parts of the country. Iran had to, really move its missile capabilities back deeper into the country in order to not be too vulnerable to Israeli strikes, but they still were. You saw over the last couple of days of the war that Iran really only managed to launch minor salvos, right? A handful of missiles, maybe 10, a bit more, but you didn't see like any of those large scale missile salvos at all. So it seems to me in that sense, Israel had it under control to some extent. The other big thing is, right, that I think Iran was not really producing new missiles anymore throughout the war. I think their supply chain probably had been interrupted greatly. I mean, maybe there had been some manufacturing ongoing still. But on the other hand, Israeli manufacturers, they were already in overdrive when it comes to interceptor production, but maybe they've tried to ramp that up even more. Although that's of course tricky because it's such a complex supply chain. But at least Israel was still producing probably as much as before the war, if not slightly more. So in that sense, they may have had a slight advantage. As to the question why it ended, I think political factors were more important. I have to emphasize here, I'm not a Middle East expert. Not the greatest at speaking on Iranian and Israeli political objectives and ambitions. But my impression is, right, that Donald Trump, he really wanted to end this just to get himself like this negotiation win. I mean, it seems to me that Trump really is all about negotiating and then bringing an end to negotiations, no matter how it ends. And, very often with Trump, because he's the president of the United States, which is the most important allies to a lot of countries in the world, he actually has more influence pressuring his allies than his adversaries. And he uses that influence to go after his allies more than after his adversaries in these negotiations. And that's the impression that I got from the ceasefire negotiations. I think Israel would have been happy to keep going, ideally with American assistance, but probably also to some extent without them. But they really were pressured by the Americans, potentially by them saying, Trump saying that if you don't end this now, we're going to seize all our support for you. And that would have been difficult for Israel. So I think, Trump as a unitary factor, I think he probably was the most important in bringing this to an end at the timing that it was.
If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important, but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description.